It was an early, cold morning on Farmer Tom's land. The wind was sharp, biting into his face as he bundled up in his thick winter coat and scarf. The sky was gray, covered with clouds, and a soft blanket of snow covered the fields and forests surrounding his farm. The kind of morning where the air feels heavy, and the world is quiet, almost still. Farmer Tom had grown used to the quiet. He lived alone in his little farmhouse, far from the busy town. The only company he had were the animals, his cows, chickens, and his old dog, Buster. But Buster was getting old, and the years had started to slow him down. Tom wasn't exactly lonely, but the silence of the farm often made the day feel long. The routine was familiar, and he liked it that way. That morning, Tom was walking across the field, checking the fences and making sure the barn was locked up tight. His boots crunched in the snow, and the sound echoed in the cold air. As he moved across the land, something strange caught his eye. There, in the distance, something dark lay on the snow, unmoving. At first, Tom thought it was a pile of old branches or maybe a fallen tree. But as he walked closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a dog, lying in the snow, completely still, as if it had collapsed right there and never moved again. Tom rushed over, his breath coming out in white puffs as he approached. The dog was large, with dark fur, but it was hard to tell much more. It was lying on its side, its body stiff from the cold, its eyes closed. Tom dropped to his knees in the snow, his hands trembling as he gently touched the dog's fur. It was cold, too cold. His fingers felt the lifelessness of the animal, and panic shot through him. Was the dog dead? Had it been out here for too long? Tom's mind raced. He checked the dog's pulse, his heart pounding with worry. There was no sign of movement, no sign of breath. The dog had to be frozen, but could it still be saved? Tom wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew how to care for animals. He had done it his whole life. His farm had always been home to creatures in need, but this situation was different. This wasn't just a sick animal that could be treated with medicine. This was a frozen dog, alone in the middle of nowhere. The first thing that came to his mind was to get the dog inside, out of the cold, and try to warm it up. He scooped the dog up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his arms. It wasn't a small dog. It was big, muscular, and heavy. He looked around, realizing how far he was from the farmhouse. There was no time to waste. Carrying the dog as best as he could, Tom rushed toward his house. His mind kept spinning, asking questions he couldn't answer. How had the dog ended up out here? Had it been abandoned, lost, or was there something more to this story? As Tom reached the house, he kicked open the door with his foot, stumbling inside with the dog in his arms. The warmth of the house was a relief, but it wasn't enough. He needed help. His heart ached for the dog in his arms, wondering if it was too late. Without wasting any more time, Tom picked up his phone and called the only person he knew who might be able to help, Dr. Emily, the town veterinarian. His voice cracked a little as he spoke, but he was trying to stay calm. Dr. Emily, it's Tom. I found a dog out here, frozen in the snow. I think it's still alive, but I don't know for sure. I need your help. He hung up the phone, holding the dog close, praying that it wasn't too late. Tom sat down on the old couch in his living room, holding the dog carefully in his lap. The warmth from the fire crackling in the stove filled the room, but it wasn't enough to comfort him. The dog was still cold, and Tom's mind raced. He could feel the life in the dog slipping away, and he didn't know if he was doing the right thing. He had called Dr. Emily, but he wasn't sure how long it would take for her to arrive. The nearest town was about a 30-minute drive, and with the snowstorm picking up outside, the roads weren't in the best condition. He had to wait. He didn't know what else to do. Tom's hands were shaking, but he gently rubbed the dog's body, trying to warm it up. He could tell the dog had been out in the cold for a while. Its fur was covered in frost, and its body was stiff. The dog's breath was shallow and weak, barely moving in and out. Tom's heart sank. He didn't want to give up on this animal, but he wasn't sure how much longer it would last. The room felt so quiet. Tom looked around at his farmhouse, the familiar walls that had been his home for years. It felt strange, knowing that something so small, a dog, could change everything in an instant. It wasn't just the dog's life on the line. It was his too. Tom had always been a man of routine, never one to take risks. But now, this dog had appeared out of nowhere, and it felt like his world had been shaken up. He glanced down at the dog again, his eyes lingering on its face. The dog was a German shepherd, with dark fur and a strong build. It looked well fed, but the way it was lying motionless in his arms made Tom wonder how it had ended up out there. Had it been abandoned, or had it been lost in the snow? Tom let out a sigh. He wished he had more answers. He could only hope that Dr. Emily would be able to save this dog, whatever its story might be. The minutes felt like hours as Tom waited for her to arrive. He kept checking the window, hoping to see her truck pull up the snowy driveway. He wondered if the dog would make it. Would it survive, or had it already been too long in the cold? Tom tried to push the negative thoughts away. He wasn't ready to give up yet. Finally, after what felt like forever, Tom heard the sound of tires crunching over the snow outside. He jumped up from the couch and rushed to the door, opening it to find Dr. Emily's truck parked outside. She stepped out, pulling her hood over her head to shield herself from the wind. She had a bag of medical supplies with her, and her face was set in a look of determination. "Tom, what happened?" Dr. Emily asked as she hurried inside. Tom explained everything quickly, his voice tight with worry. "I found him out in the field, frozen solid. I think he's still alive, but I don't know for how much longer. I tried to keep him warm, but—" "Let's take a look," Dr. Emily said, cutting him off gently. She knelt down in front of the dog, placing her hand on its side. The dog's breathing was faint, but it was still there. Dr. Emily checked the dog's eyes, feeling around its neck for a pulse. Her face remained calm, but Tom could tell she was focused. "We're not out of the woods yet," she said after a few moments, "but I think we can save him. We just need to warm him up carefully. It's a good sign that he's still breathing." Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There was hope. Dr. Emily worked quickly, covering the dog in blankets and placing warm bottles of water near its body. She kept a close eye on the dog's breathing, making sure it was stable. Tom stayed close by, watching every move she made. Time seemed to stand still as they worked together, hoping for a miracle. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dog's breathing became a little stronger. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that it was fighting to stay alive. Tom's heart lifted a little. They weren't out of danger yet, but the dog had made it through the worst. For now. At least, there was hope. Dr. Emily continued to work gently with the dog, her movements slow and careful. Tom sat beside her, watching closely as she checked the dog's temperature and made sure it was recovering. The dog was no longer as stiff as before, and its breathing had become more steady. Though it was still weak, there was a definite sign of life. After a while, Dr. Emily looked up at Tom, wiping the sweat from her brow. "He's a fighter," she said with a small smile. "I think he's going to pull through, but we need to be patient and keep him warm." Tom let out a sigh of relief, though he still wasn't completely sure the dog would make it. There were so many things that could go wrong, but Dr. Emily was confident. He trusted her experience, but it was hard not to worry when the dog was still so fragile. As the hours passed, the dog's condition improved. It seemed to relax, no longer trembling from the cold. Its fur was no longer frozen, and it appeared to be breathing normally. Tom noticed that the dog had started to shift slightly, moving its legs and tail. It wasn't much, but it was a good sign. Dr. Emily stood up and stretched her arms. "I think we can safely say that he's out of the worst of it," she said. "But I'll stay here for a bit longer to make sure he's completely stable." Tom nodded and got up to make some tea. As he moved around the kitchen, He couldn't help but wonder more about the dog. It was clear that this wasn't just any random animal. There was something special about it. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, up close, he could see the dog's collar. It was worn and old, the metal slightly rusted. He squinted at the tag. The name on the tag read Max. Tom paused, his fingers running over the letters. Max. It seemed like a simple name, but it felt familiar somehow. He stared at the tag for a moment longer before the memories began to flood back. 2 years ago, there had been a story in town about a German shepherd that had gone missing. The dog belonged to Margaret, an elderly woman who lived just down the road from Tom's farm. Margaret had always been a kind woman with a love for animals. Tom remembered her fondly, having helped her out on her small farm many times. After she passed away, her family had tried to find Max, but they couldn't. They assumed he had run away or worse, had gotten lost in the wilds of the forest. The town had given up hope of finding him. Tom couldn't believe it. This was Max, the dog that had been lost for so long. He stared down at the dog, still unsure of what had brought him to Tom's farm. Had Max wandered this far from home, or had something else happened? He felt a lump in his throat as he thought about Margaret, the sweet old woman who had loved this dog so much. Her family had been devastated when Max disappeared. They had searched everywhere, but it seemed like Max had vanished without a trace. Dr. Emily noticed Tom's expression and followed his gaze to the dog's collar. Max, she said quietly, a look of recognition crossing her face. You're right. This is the dog from Margaret's farm. I remember when he went missing. It was one of the saddest things in the town. Everyone loved Margaret, and her dog was part of her family. Tom's heart sank. Max had been lost for so long, and now he was here. He had survived the cold, alone, out in the wilderness for years. It was a miracle he was even alive. I never thought I'd see him again, Tom murmured, his voice filled with emotion. I don't know how he made it out there. Dr. Emily shook her head. It's amazing. Max must have been incredibly strong to survive in those conditions, but we may never know exactly what happened. The important thing is that he's here now, and we can help him. Tom nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. He had found this dog on his land, frozen and alone, but now he knew Max had a story, a history. It wasn't just any dog. It was a survivor. And somehow, that made him feel even more connected to the dog. Max wasn't just a lost animal. He was a part of the town's history, a piece of Margaret's life, and now, a part of Tom's farm. For the first time since Max had been found, Tom allowed himself to smile. This was a beginning, not an end. Max had made it through the worst, and now Tom was determined to help him heal. The days that followed were filled with careful attention to Max's recovery. Dr. Emily visited each day, bringing fresh supplies and checking on his progress. She was amazed by how quickly Max seemed to be recovering. The first few days were the hardest, but slowly, Max started to regain his strength. His breathing became more regular, and his body temperature stabilized. The frostbitten areas of his fur were no longer as cold, and he began to show signs of interest in the world around him again. Tom kept a close eye on Max, spending his days in the warm living room, sitting beside the dog as he rested. It was strange, the way Max's presence seemed to fill the room with a new kind of energy. Tom wasn't used to having a dog around anymore. His old dog, Buster, had been with him for years, but now, after Buster's passing, Tom had grown used to the silence. Max, however, was different. Even though the dog was still weak, there was a quiet sense of companionship in the air, something that Tom hadn't realized he was missing. As the days passed, Max's personality began to show itself. He was calm and gentle, yet there was an undeniable strength in his eyes. He'd watch Tom with a quiet attention, as though trying to understand him, trying to figure out where he was. Max had been through so much. He had survived out there alone for so long. Tom couldn't help but feel a deep respect for the dog. He didn't know what had happened in those lost years, but whatever it was, Max had kept fighting. One morning, about a week after Max's rescue, Tom decided it was time to try something different. He'd been taking small steps to reintroduce Max to the outdoors. The first time they went out together, it had been just a brief walk around the yard, with Max limping slightly and staying close to Tom. But today, Tom felt ready to take a longer walk. "Let's see if you're up for a little adventure, Max," Tom said, standing by the door. Max raised his head, his ears twitching as he looked at Tom, clearly eager to go. His tail wagged slightly, a sign that he was feeling better, and his eyes brightened with a mix of curiosity and excitement. Tom opened the door, and the cold air hit them both. The snow had started to melt a little, leaving patches of icy ground beneath their boots. Max stepped outside hesitantly at first, sniffing the air. But then, after a few cautious steps, he began to walk more confidently, his muscles working under his fur. It was clear that he was still weak, but the life was returning to him, bit by bit. Tom smiled as he watched Max move more freely. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Max was coming back to life. They walked around the farm, the fresh snow crunching underfoot. The sky was clear, and the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, casting a soft glow over the land. The quiet of the countryside seemed to wrap around them, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the trees in the breeze and the occasional bark from Max. Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with Max. It wasn't just about the rescue anymore. It was about the bond that was forming between them. Max had been through so much, and yet here he was, walking beside Tom, trusting him, even though they had just met. Tom had been alone for a long time, but now he realized that Max was helping him too. The dog wasn't just recovering. He was teaching Tom something about patience, hope, and the strength to keep going, even when things seemed impossible. As they walked, Max began to pick up his pace. His tail wagged a little more, and his eyes brightened as he took in the world around him. Tom chuckled softly. "You're doing great, Max," he said. "It's good to see you back out here." Max turned his head to look up at Tom, his expression filled with quiet understanding. Tom felt a warmth in his chest as he realized that Max wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting to live again, and it was because of the care, patience, and love that Tom had shown him. By the time they returned to the house, Max was tired but happy. He trotted back inside, wagging his tail, as if to say that he was ready for more adventures to come. Tom smiled, closing the door behind them. He knew this was just the beginning of something special. Max had survived the worst, and now, together, they were building something new. Tom had given the dog a second chance at life, and in return, Max had given Tom something he hadn't realized he needed, a reminder that it was never too late to start over. As the weeks passed, Max continued to grow stronger. His coat, once dull and lifeless, began to shine again, and the limp in his step faded. He spent more and more time outside, exploring the farm with Tom. The two had formed a quiet understanding, and Max was always by his side, following him around as if he had never been lost in the first place. Max had become a part of the farm in ways Tom hadn't expected. He wasn't just a dog Tom had rescued. Max had quickly settled into the rhythm of farm life, guarding the chickens from the occasional fox and alerting Tom if anything unusual happened. He was gentle, but there was a protective side to him that reminded Tom of how strong the dog truly was. It was clear that Max was no longer the frightened, weak animal he had found in the snow. One afternoon, Tom was fixing the fence that ran along the edge of the property. It was a simple job, but as he worked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It had been a long time since he'd had someone to share the work with. Max sat nearby, watching him with an attentive gaze, as though he was keeping watch. It was a familiar scene. Just the two of them, working together, the quiet of the countryside surrounding them. Suddenly, Tom heard a noise behind him. He turned around just in time to see Max spring into action. The dog's ears perked up, and with a burst of energy, he darted toward the edge of the field. Tom quickly followed, wondering what had caught Max's attention. When Tom reached the spot, he saw it, a small rabbit, frozen in place in the tall grass. Max was standing still, his nose twitching as he watched the rabbit closely. He didn't make a sound, his body poised like a hunting dog ready to pounce. But instead of chasing after the rabbit, Max remained where he was, calmly observing it. Tom smiled, impressed by the dog's restraint. "You've got the instincts, that's for sure," he muttered to himself. Max's hunting instincts were still there, but he wasn't acting out of hunger or fear. It seemed like he was simply curious, just like Tom. After a few moments, Max relaxed and walked back to Tom, who was still watching the rabbit, now disappearing into the grass. "That's some good work, Max," Tom said, giving the dog a pat on the head. Max looked up at him with his warm, dark eyes, his tail wagging gently. It was clear that the bond between them had grown deeper, and Max was no longer just a pet or a survivor. He was Tom's companion, his friend. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Tom sat on the porch with Max by his side. The quiet of the evening felt different now, more peaceful. Max had become a steady presence in Tom's life, and the loneliness that had once filled the house no longer seemed so heavy. Tom looked out over the land, the field stretching out into the distance. He thought about everything that had happened, how he had found Max, how the dog had fought to survive, and how they had both changed in the time they had spent together. Tom had always worked hard on the farm, but he had never realized how much more fulfilling life could be with someone else to share it with. Max nudged Tom's hand with his nose, bringing him out of his thoughts. Tom smiled and scratched the dog behind the ears. "I'm glad you found your way here, Max," he said softly. The dog's tail thumped the ground in response, and Tom chuckled. It was in that quiet moment, sitting on the porch with Max by his side, that Tom truly realized the impact the dog had on his life. Max hadn't just healed physically, he had helped heal something deeper inside Tom too. It wasn't just about saving a dog anymore. It was about the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, and the love that was growing between them. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Tom felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them, with Max by his side. Together, they had found a new beginning, and Tom knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, just like they always had. One crisp morning, a letter arrived at Tom's farmhouse. It was an unexpected surprise, especially since Tom had grown used to the quiet life, where few people came and went. Tom opened the envelope slowly, curious about who would be sending him mail. As he read the letter, his face changed from confusion to concern. It was from Margaret's family. The letter explained that they had been looking for Max for years after he disappeared and were hoping to find him. They had never given up hope that he was still alive, but they had thought he was lost forever. Now, with some new information and a bit of luck, they had traced Max to Tom's farm. They were coming to visit soon to see if it was truly their beloved dog. Tom felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he finished reading. He knew this moment would come someday. Margaret's family deserved answers, and they had a right to see Max again. But at the same time, Tom couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Max had become a part of his life. He had worked so hard to help the dog heal, and the bond they had built was strong. Tom had come to love Max, and now it seemed like that might be tested. Max, who had been lying beside Tom, lifted his head and looked at him with curiosity, sensing that something was different. Tom scratched behind Max's ears, trying to calm his own racing thoughts. "Hey, buddy," Tom said softly. "Looks like we're going to have some visitors soon." Over the next few days, Tom tried to prepare himself for what was coming. He wasn't sure how Max would react to seeing Margaret's family again. After all, Max had been lost for so long. Would he remember them? Would he want to go back with them? It was a difficult thought to swallow. On the day Margaret's family arrived, Tom was waiting by the front gate. The car pulled up, and 3 people stepped out. A middle-aged man, a woman who looked like she could be his sister, and a teenage girl. The man was holding a leash, which looked strangely empty without Max at the end of it. The man nodded, his eyes scanning the farm with a mix of hope and hesitation. "Yes, we've heard he might be here. We've been searching for him for so long." "I understand," Tom replied, his voice steady. "Max is inside. He's doing well, but he's been through a lot. I don't know how he'll react to seeing you." The group nodded, and the woman spoke gently. "We understand. We just want to see him, even if it's only for a little while." Tom led them inside, where Max was resting in the living room. He was stretched out on the floor, looking peaceful and content. But when he heard the door open, Max perked up, his ears twitching. The familiar scent of strangers filled the room, and Max slowly stood up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the new arrivals. The woman stepped forward first, her eyes filled with emotion. "Max," she said softly, her voice trembling. Max's ears pricked up, and he took a cautious step toward her, sniffing the air. For a moment, it seemed as if he didn't recognize her. But then, something changed. Max's tail started to wag slowly, and he stepped closer, his eyes softening. The woman's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Max, it's really you," she cried out, her voice thick with tears. Max approached her, sniffing her hand before letting out a soft bark. The man and the teenage girl joined her, and they all knelt down to greet the dog. Tom stood back, watching as the family reconnected with the dog they had lost so many years ago. But as Max's tail wagged more excitedly, Tom's heart ached. He realized that Max might remember these people after all. They were his family, the ones who had cared for him before he disappeared. But was this where Max truly belonged? The family spent the next hour with Max, talking to him, petting him, and sharing memories. They showed Tom pictures of Max when he was just a puppy, and it became clear that Max had been deeply loved by them. It was a bittersweet moment for Tom, seeing the joy on their faces as they watched Max react to them. But he also knew that Max was not the same dog who had left them. Max had a new life now, and Tom had become a part of that life too. Finally, after a quiet pause, the man turned to Tom. "We've missed him so much," he said, "but we can see that Max is happy here with you. He's found a new family." Tom nodded, his heart heavy but grateful. "I've grown to love him too," he said softly. "I don't want to take him from you, but I also don't want him to leave here if he's truly happy." The family exchanged looks, understanding the depth of the bond between Tom and Max. After a moment, the woman spoke, her voice full of warmth. "We can see that Max has found his place here. We don't want to take him from you, Tom. We just wanted to see him again, and we're so glad we did." Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. The decision had been made. Max was home, right where he belonged. After the visit from Margaret's family, Tom couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. He had always known that he wasn't Max's original owner, but now, more than ever, he felt a strong connection to the dog. The family had shown up, and they had shared their love for Max, but they had also understood something important. Max had found a new place to belong. He had found a home with Tom. Over the next few weeks, life returned to a comfortable rhythm. Max was stronger than ever, and the bond between him and Tom continued to grow. The dog had become an even more important part of Tom's daily routine. They spent hours together, working around the farm, taking long walks, or simply sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. Max was always there, by Tom's side, offering his quiet companionship. One afternoon, while Tom was fixing the fence again, Max was nearby, his head tilted as he watched Tom with deep, intelligent eyes. Tom paused for a moment, feeling a sense of gratitude. Max had been through so much, but he had never once given up. It was as if the dog had known, even when he was alone in the wilderness, that there would be a chance for a new beginning. That's exactly what Max had found, a new chance at life, and it was a chance that Tom had helped him find. As the seasons changed, so did the farm. Spring arrived, and the fields began to bloom with bright flowers and green grass. It was a time of renewal, a time for new growth. Max seemed to thrive during this time, his coat now thick and shiny, his muscles strong. Tom could see that Max was happy, truly happy, and it filled him with a warmth he hadn't expected. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Tom decided to take Max on a longer walk. It had become their favorite time of day. The quiet, peaceful moments just before nightfall. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging, as they walked along the path that led to the edge of the forest. The cool breeze rustled the trees, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. As they walked, Tom thought about the future. He thought about how life had changed since Max had come into it. The quiet days had turned into something fuller, something more meaningful. The silence that had once been so heavy was now filled with the soft sounds of Max's paws on the earth and the occasional bark of joy when he discovered something new. Tom had never realized how much he needed a companion until Max had come into his life. They'd reached a small hill on the edge of the property, a place where Tom often went to sit and think. He had been here many times, but tonight felt different. He sat down on the grass, patting the spot beside him. Max lay down beside him, resting his head on Tom's lap as they both watched the sunset in peaceful silence. Tom could feel the warmth of the sun on his face, the quiet of the world around him. It was a perfect moment, one he would always treasure. "You know, Max," Tom said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've changed my life. I never expected you to come into my world like this, but I'm so glad you did." Max lifted his head and looked up at Tom, his eyes calm and trusting. Tom smiled, gently scratching behind Max's ears. There was no need for words. The bond between them was clear. It wasn't about what they said or did. It was about the quiet moments they shared, the trust they had built, and the unspoken understanding between them. From that moment on, Tom knew that Max was more than just a dog. He was family. They had both been through difficult times, but together, they had found a way to heal. Max had taught Tom about resilience, about the power of second chances, and about the importance of companionship. As the days went by, Max continued to thrive. He was no longer the dog who had been found frozen in the snow, struggling to survive. He was strong, healthy, and full of life. And Tom was no longer the lonely man who had spent his days on a quiet farm. He had found a true friend, someone who would be there with him through everything, just as he would be there for Max. Their story was one of healing, of a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. And as they sat together on that hill, watching the sunset, both Max and Tom knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side, together, always. As time passed, Max and Tom's bond only deepened. Life on the farm had found its rhythm, with Max always by Tom's side. They had become a team, working together every day. Whether it was fixing fences, tending to the animals, or simply taking walks in the countryside. The peaceful, quiet days had a way of turning into something special when they were shared with a friend like Max. Tom never expected his life to change so much when he rescued the dog that day. But now, looking back, he couldn't imagine life without him. One cold winter morning, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Tom and Max were outside, taking their usual walk through the fields. The world around them seemed still and silent, the snowflakes drifting gently from the sky. Max trotted happily beside Tom, his breath visible in the chilly air. His coat had grown thick and strong, and the limp that once slowed him down was gone. Max was full of energy now, ready to explore every corner of the farm. Tom smiled as he watched the dog, feeling a deep sense of pride. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, Max had been found nearly frozen, struggling to survive. "Look at you, Max," Tom said, his voice filled with affection. "You've come so far." Max looked up at him, his dark eyes sparkling, and gave a little bark as if agreeing. It seemed like he had become a different dog, full of life and happiness, but the memory of the struggle to survive never left Tom's mind. It was a reminder of how strong Max truly was, and how lucky they both were to have found each other. As they walked through the snow-covered fields, Tom began to think about the future. He had always been content with his quiet life on the farm, but now, with Max by his side, things felt even more complete. He couldn't imagine a future without the dog. Max had become more than just a companion. He was family. Tom realized that his life had been forever changed by that one cold morning when he found Max in the snow. When they reached the edge of the property, where the trees lined the forest, Tom stopped and sat down on a large rock. Max sat beside him, his head resting on Tom's knee as they both watched the snowfall. It was a moment of peace, a moment to appreciate how far they had come together. The bond they shared had become something deeper than words could express. "I don't know what the future holds, Max," Tom said softly, "but I do know one thing. I'm not letting you go. You're home now. Forever." Max lifted his head at the sound of his name, looking up at Tom with eyes full of trust and affection. It was as if he understood exactly what Tom meant. For a moment, the two of them simply sat there, watching the world go by, knowing that they had found something rare and beautiful, unconditional love and loyalty that would last a lifetime. The next few weeks brought new joys to the farm. Max continued to thrive, playing with the other animals and guarding the property with the same protective instinct he had shown from the very beginning. Tom had never seen a dog quite like him, and he was proud of how far Max had come. But it wasn't just Max's physical recovery that had made a difference. The dog had helped heal Tom's heart in ways he hadn't expected. The loneliness that had once weighed heavily on him was gone. Max had filled the emptiness, and in return, Tom had given Max a home, a place where he could feel safe and loved. One day, as Tom worked in the barn, he looked out the window and saw Max sitting on the porch, watching the farm with his usual calm attention. Tom paused for a moment, taking in the sight. It was hard to imagine that the dog who had once been lost and alone was now so full of life, so content. Max had found his place, and Tom had found a true friend. As the winter continued, Tom knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but he no longer felt alone in facing them. With Max by his side, he felt ready for anything. They had both been through so much, but together, they had created something beautiful, a home filled with love, trust, and the kind of bond that lasts forever. And as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, Tom knew in his heart that no matter what came next, he and Max would always be there for each other. They had found their forever home, and nothing could ever change that.